Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure, a nostalgic pleasure, to follow the Honourable Member for Sheffield and Hallam and hear him reiterate the fears that he first enunciated if we left the ERM. And those fears proved wrong.
Exactly.
And then the fears which he next enunciated if we didn't join the euro. And they proved the reverse of the truth.
Exactly.
So it's nostalgic to hear him recycling his damaged goods today again. But it's even more of a pleasure to follow from my right honourable friend, the member for Woking, because he and I worked together at the DTI. And I think I am the only serving member of Parliament, possibly, apart from the member for Sheffield and Hallam, who has experience of negotiating successfully an international trade deal. And with my right honourable friend, we introduced the single market programme into this country. And so we have some experience, and I want to apply that experience to some of the arguments, because I find on this issue, on most issues, we in politics, when we've got no experience about anything, we simply adopt the most plausible argument which supports our case. And that, by and large, is what happens on matters of trade and economics in this House, because there's so little experience of it. I suppose, in a way, I'm a member of an endangered species, being one of the few who has experience of this. But let me first of all take the very idea that trade agreements are necessary and essential for trade. Their importance, I hate to say it, because I've got a vested interest in claiming my experience of these things, are less important than people imagine, particularly between developed countries, very largely because of the success of the Uruguay round, which brought down tariffs between developed countries to negligible levels. The average tariff that would apply to British exports to the EU, in the almost inconceivable circumstances that we had no free trade agreement with them, the WTO tariff that would then apply to our goods would average 2.4%. Better not to have that. I'd rather not have that. But compared with the movements in the exchange rate, it is negligible and much less important than we play out. The only important trade deals are those with the fast-growing markets of Asia, of Latin America, of Europe, which still do have high tariff levels, and we ought to be looking to negotiate trade deals with them.
The Honourable Gentleman.
But, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I entirely agree with everything that the Right Honourable Gentleman has said. But what we haven't discussed so far is that people want us, they want our market just as much as we may want their market. So it takes two to tango in any trade deal, and trade deals will go on regardless.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Of course, trade deals take place because they're in the mutual interests of both parties. They're not actually a military conflict. They're something like trade itself, which takes place between two parties. Now, a very plausible but incorrect argument is that trade agreements always take a long time. When the Secretary of the State for Foreign Affairs was asked whether they'd done any study of trade agreements, he sidestepped the question, because actually a Freedom of Information request revealed that neither the Treasury nor the government have done any study of these trade agreements about which they talk so knowledgeably. But studies have been done. I refer to the one by Professor Moser, Professor of European Centre of Studies in Germany somewhere, who has done a study of every single trade agreement in the last 15 years, 20 years. And there are 88 of them, I might admit, 88 of them. The average time they took was 28 months. 28 months. But there was a great variety of times. And the ones that took a long time, which certainly concurs with my experience, that those that involved lots of countries. And of course, by definition, any EU treaty involves 28 countries and takes a long time, because all those 28 countries have vetoes, and a lot of EU treaties now are being held up. I'll continue if I may. But bilateral treaties between two countries take less than that average 28 months. So we shouldn't start deluding people that it's going to take a long time to negotiate bilateral deals with countries which already, for example, have bilateral deals with Switzerland. The member for Sheffield asked rhetorically whether there was anyone queuing up for trade deals with us. Well, don't look for what they say, look for what they do. Switzerland has trade deals with countries whose total GDP is 4 times that of the countries with which the EU has trade deals. Chile has trade deals with countries whose GDP collectively is even bigger than that. Switzerland has a trade deal with China. We're told it's a bad deal for Switzerland. Clearly the Swiss didn't think so. The Swiss on their website publish the details of this deal, and you can look at it. And by the time EU even gets around to negotiating a trade deal with China, which, by the way, they'll never succeed because they always insist on human rights terms that the Chinese won't accept.
Exactly.
The Swiss will have 0 tariffs on the vast majority of their exports to China. I give way to my honourable friend.
My right honourable friend giving way. And he is, of course, a distinguished former Trade Secretary, knows what he's on about. But and we come from different sides of the debate on this issue. But would he accept that all of his experience, all of his wisdom, and all of his contacts, both in the Commonwealth and in the European Union, in particular on the Commonwealth, Brexiteers invoke the Commonwealth leaders as wanting to do business with Britain in or out of Europe? Is it not the case that Commonwealth leaders want to have a trade deal with the whole of Europe, not just with the United Kingdom?
Well, they probably want trade deals with whoever they can negotiate sensible trade deals with, if they're sensible, and they won't say it's either or. They will want a trade deal with us because we are the 5th biggest economy in the world, and they probably want a trade deal with the EU, but they'll find it takes a very long time because all 28 countries will have to agree to it first. Now, there's a suggestion very often that the deals that the EU gets will be better because it's bigger. Actually, not only are they more complicated to do with lots of countries, but they take longer, but the result is worse, less comprehensive, because you have 28 times as many exceptions and exclusions. So they're less comprehensive trade deals. And as far as the UK is concerned, they're even less likely to be in our interest because we can see what's happened so far. 1/3 of the trade deals the EU has negotiated with other countries, perhaps in a minute, 1/3 of those deals don't include services. Services are very important to this country, has been repeatedly stated, but less important to the rest of the EU, so they don't bother to include services in it. Now, Switzerland, of course, also has a great importance attached to exporting services, so over 90% of their trade deals do include services, as of course would ours if we were independent and making our own deals.
I'm grateful to give you away. He mentions Switzerland quite often, and Switzerland are part of the European Economic Area, but still locate their banking services in London to access the rest of the European Union through the passporting agreements. Has he looked at that particular problem, and has he got a solution for that difficulty?
Actually, they moved their banking centres to London post-Big Bang and before the single market. I actually negotiated the second banking directive, which introduced passporting for banks. And I was very proud of it, and I subsequently wanted to make a speech saying what a wonderful thing it was and what a wonderful thing the single market programme was. And I asked my officials to find examples of banks which were, and others which were using, doing things made possible by the single market programme in this sort of passporting. They couldn't find a single one that was at that stage, because nearly all banks actually trade through subsidiaries, which means that they don't take advantage of the passporting. Passporting allows you to operate through a branch rather than a subsidiary, regulated by the British financial authorities rather than by the country in which they operate. They choose to do it through banks. There are other countries, and I'll perhaps come on to that, other aspects of the passporting issue, which I'll come on to. If time permits, I'll give way because the honourable members speak.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I always listen very carefully to what he says. And he's made a very strong case about the difficulties as a large trading bloc of 27 nations negotiating and the time it would take to do that. So why is it that he does feel that in short measure it would be possible for the UK to re-establish its trading relations with an EU that no longer had us as part of it, because he's made a very compelling case to show why that wouldn't be possible.
That's a very good point. I was going to come on to it. It takes quite a long time, for example, for the EU to negotiate a trade deal with Canada, because each country's got tariffs against the other, and different product specifications and so on. And they're having to trade off a cut in tariffs on steel against another cut in tariffs against leather goods. And you can see that could take a long time, particularly if there's not much enthusiasm for it at all. If you're starting, as we do, with the rest of Europe, with zero tariffs on both sides, and with common product standards, 0 to 0 can be negotiated in a fairly short space of time, I would have thought, compared with 10,000 different tariff lines which involved in other tariff agreements. So it should not take long, goodwill on both sides, to negotiate a continuing free trade deal. No, I'm afraid the honourable member has burnt his boats.
Sit down.
But there's another myth, which is, was I'm afraid, actually proffered by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and that is that we will need to renegotiate a trade agreement with all the countries with which the EU currently has trade agreements. That is not the case. There is an accepted principle in international law, the principle of continuity, that if a political unit splits into parts, like the Soviet Union did, for example, or Czechoslovakia did, then the component parts continue with that agreement unless one party objects to it. And there's absolutely no reason to suppose that the countries with which we currently are party to free trade agreements, when we leave, will want to end that free trade agreement. For example, when the Soviet Union broke up, it then was not a member of the WTO, so it had traded under separate trade agreements, I'll come to it in a minute, with other countries. Those trade agreements automatically novated, or by agreement novated, so that even America, within weeks, had novated its agreement to Russia and other successor states. There's absolutely no reason. I'm sorry, I'm under pressure to finish, so I will try to do so. Just one final word, if I may, Mr. Speaker, on the single market. The single market is often talked about as if it's some arcane inner sanctum. It is simply the European market.
That's all it is.
It's like the American single market. We have no agreement with the American single market. We're not members of the American single market. It's nonetheless our biggest trading country nationally in the world. All the single market consisted of was standardizing the product specification. So instead of having to have 28 different ranges of refrigerator or lawn mower or whatever, you have one. And that's very sensible. But it's just as much an advantage to an exporter from outside the EU exporting refrigerators or lawnmowers into the EU as it is for member states within it. And actually, they've taken more advantage of it than we have. Their exports have gone up more than ours have, perhaps because they don't have to bear the burden of EU regulations on 100% of their firms, but only on those aspects of their activities carried out within the EU. That's another aspect of the benefits that we would get from leaving, along with our ability to negotiate free trade agreements with the fast-growing but protected markets of the world on whom our children's future will depend.